Most of you here, I think, probably know me as the wife of Dr. Michael Eades. Those that read his Arrow newsletter probably know me as the bride. That's what he calls me in the newsletter. And I'm all of those things, but I'm also a physician and a low-carb practitioner of many years. Where do I point it? Oh, that. There we go. Low-carb practitioner of many years and a devoted, unapologetic advocate for low-carb eating. We together have written all of this library of books on low-carb and on nutrition and on exercise, and I do still get royalties from some of those, but other than that, I have absolutely nothing to disclose. I think Rod may have asked us to speak about this today because we've been at it for so long. It was 40 years ago when we first started putting patients in our medical clinic on a low-carb structure in order for them to lose weight and to solve their weight-related health problems, which of course are the entire metabolic syndrome, although at the time that name didn't exist. That's how long ago it's been. But it was in 1989 that Mike, actually, not both of us, Mike actually first published his first book, which was called Thin So Fast. It was a description of how to undertake a protein-sparing modified fast, a shake diet, if you remember those, safely yourself at home. It was the one that Oprah Winfrey had used to lose a tremendous amount of weight back in the late 80s. And I think some of you probably here remember when she donned her size 10 Calvin Klein jeans and she pulled her little red wagon filled with 67 pounds of fat, representing the weight that she had lost, and revealed that she had done it on a program called OptiFast. Everybody in the country, in the United States, was waiting to find out how she'd lost all this weight. And it was on OptiFast, which is a protein-sparing fast. The day that happened, I know, was November 15th, 1988. And the reason I know that, well, one, it's the day after my birthday, but that's not why I knew. The reason that I know that is because it was the day that Mike had just turned in his completed manuscript for the Thin So Fast book to the FedEx to be sent to the publisher for them to do their last things on it for publication. And of course, it was a book about a protein-sparing fast. So you can imagine how over the moon this Warner Books was when Oprah has just announced she loses her weight on a protein-sparing fast, and now they have in their hands the manuscript for how to do it at home. Because at the time, protein-sparing modified fasting was only done in hospital settings or in clinic settings under the supervision of a doctor, and it cost many thousands of dollars, and insurance didn't pay for it. And so it put it really out of reach for a tremendous number of people who could have benefited from it, profited from it, have lost weight with it, but they couldn't afford it. So Mike decided he would write a book about how to do it because we'd been doing it with our own patients in the clinic, and we knew that it was safe, and we knew that it done properly, that people wouldn't have trouble with it, and there was really no reason that they had to come every single week and pay a lot of money to do it. So the first problem we had with it was that there was no such thing as a protein-sparing modified fast shake. There weren't meal replacement shakes then. Shelves in grocery stores and health food stores didn't look like this. Nothing existed. So we had to come up with a recipe that people could make themselves at home with things that they could get at the grocery store or the health food store and put together this plan where they would eat 3 or 4 shakes a day, and then for added safety, a single whole food, low carb meal at night. And so we did that, but this was at a time where the dietary landscape was completely low fat. I mean, this is 1989, and it's the height of low fat mania. And even a number of years later, when we wrote Protein Power, it was still a low fat landscape. You know, that's changed to a degree, maybe not as far as we would like yet, but it has changed in the last 40 years. And now it goes by a million different names, and you can call it keto or paleo or carnivore or all meat or low carb, whatever you want to call it. It's really all variations on the same general theme. And it spawned a huge library of books, different ways of doing it. And all of these things have their nuances, but there's a whole lot more similar about them than there is different about them. And in fact, the similarities tend to outweigh them by many magnitudes, and the differences are more like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. They're all very, very much the same thing, and they do pretty much the same thing. But back in 1989, People were not, that this was not a message they were ready to hear at that point. Well, maybe they were, because at the time that we brought it out, a number of reputable physicians from institutions of major import, and Harvard being one, wrote and called the publisher and demanded that they withdraw Mike's book, saying that if they didn't, thousands and thousands of people were going to die if they published this book. But the publisher went forward, and they did publish the book, and as you might know, masses of people did not die, and nor did they a number of years later when 4 million people bought Protein Power and adopted that. They didn't die either. And it's kind of a unique position to be in from then to look forward to now, and to think that 23 million people used keto last year, or so the figures say. They at least said they did. And it's a $5 billion industry. There's still people who are saying it's a fad diet. It's a fad diet. It's a trend that's going to fade in time. And there's no doubt that nutritional trends happen. I mean, if you haven't been asleep under a rock for the last 40 years, you know what happened with the low-fat craze and how it moved the market and how it changed people's lives, not necessarily for the better. The effect that it had on the bellies and the triglyceride levels and the glucose levels of people who adopted it. Eggs used to be incredible and edible, and then for a time they were demonized to the point that just have one egg a week. And beef used to be what was for dinner. And then it tried to struggle to position itself into a low-fat landscape with slogans like, beef can be a part of a healthy low-fat diet. And, none of that worked. But fortunately, low carb has had another of its resurgences. It's resurging now, and with it, eggs are now having a resurgence in sales, butter's back, beef is back in the center of the plate unapologetically, and that's all, as far as I'm concerned, a great thing. And that's how it is now. Things have changed in the last 40 years that we've been preaching the low-carb structure. And I'm not saying we changed it, but I'm proud to say we did do at least a shift on the line. And I hope that it continues as it goes into the future. But low-carb didn't begin with us. It didn't even begin with Dr. Atkins. I'll let you in on a secret. It began 3.5 million years ago at the dawn of human time. When our first upright walking pre-human ancestors began to scavenge, as Mike talked about earlier, scavenge the kills of larger, more capable predators. And they used their unique ability to use crude tools of one kind and another, and to develop those tools to crack the bones and crack the skulls and get at the marrow and the brain, which allowed them to develop bigger brains and allowed them to develop bigger stature, and allowed them to become really skilled hunters and to develop tools where they could cooperatively hunt, such as spears. And then if you add to that the harnessing of fire, which was maybe, 500,000 or some people say 1 million years ago, but once they harnessed fire and they could cook the meat and dry the meat and keep it around for longer periods, and they could harden their spear shafts and protect themselves from predation by other predators, from becoming prey themselves, man became an eater of meat, a seeker of meat, and as Mike said earlier, with sharpened sticks, hunted large game animals completely to extinction in the quest for meat. Long about 50 to 65,000 years ago, a great climate change occurred, like it is doing now. The great climate change caused the sea levels to drop, and when it did, all of these various human species that Mike showed you earlier began to migrate out of Africa, and they went to every habitable point on the globe, including here in Australia and a crossover into North America. And about 15,000, maybe 40,000, somewhere in there years ago, all of the species died out but one, and that was Homo sapiens. That's anatomically modern humans. That's us, the skilled hunter, the meat lover. That's who we are. So if it's a fad diet, it's a fad diet that's lasted hundreds of thousands of years. In fact, until the origins of agriculture, which maybe was 5 to 10,000 years ago, depending on where you are in the world, actually much more recently than that in North America. when we adopted the planting of grain, the cultivation of grain as our main food source and stepped away from the meat and fat-based diet that we had had many millennia of natural selection sculpt our genomes and our physiology and our biochemistry to eat, we reaped a lot of health problems, starting with the Egyptians, as Mike talked about earlier. It was a good thing for civilization, but it was not a good thing for the individual civilians within that civilization necessarily. And really, an example of that, of what happened in that shift, happened right here. The work of Karen O'Day and her team, looking at Australian Aboriginal people who had moved away from the bush and come into the city and adopted a diet, a Western diet, processed food diet, and had reaped the whirlwind of health maladies that come with that change. They developed diabetes and obesity and hypertension and all the problems that we know are inherent in leaving your traditional diet. But what Dr. O'Day and her team did was to take these people, put them back on their traditional diet and their lifestyle, and what happened? Their problems resolved. They got better. So the return to their traditional diet was exactly what they needed, and I hope they all kept that. A similar thing, but slightly different, happened in North America in the work that was done by Claire Cassidy in two Native American populations who were separated basically by time, and we'll see by a little more. These two bands of pre-contact Native Americans lived in what is now the state of Kentucky in the United States. The first group lived in western Kentucky in the area marked there as Indian Knoll about 5,000 years ago. They were hunter-gatherers, but they were non-nomadic hunter-gatherers. They lived in fixed villages, something like this artist rendering might have been, and they hunted and fished and gathered along the banks of the Green and Ohio rivers. When Dr. Cassidy and her team examined the trash heaps, the middens of their village, what she discovered is that they subsisted on a diet like this, of snails, mussels, and small mammals, box turtle, fish, and very little in the way of wild plant food, berries, nuts, seeds. And the other group, who lived in western Kentucky, lived there about 350 to 500 years ago, but still pre-contact. They had not had contact. And they were farmers. And when they examined their trash heaps, their middens, what they saw was that they primarily subsisted on carbohydrates, squash, bean, and corns, that they supplemented a little bit with some small mammals and some box turtle. So these are two people in the same general area, living the same general kind of lifestyle, who were separated by time, and they were separated by diet, and as it turns out, they were separated by health. Dr. Cassidy's team examined about 300 skeletons from each of these two groups, and what she discovered was that the hunters, the ones that lived at Indian Knoll and that were the hunters, had strong, straight bones, sound teeth, little signs of tooth decay, very rare tooth decay, and almost no signs of any lasting nutritional stress or nutritional deficiencies. Whereas the farmers at Hardin Village had quite the opposite. In children and adults, there were widespread evidence of iron deficiency anemia. They had massive amounts of tooth decay, of tooth loss, of tooth abscesses, of infections in the bones, and other signs of major nutritional stress that can be seen in the bones. So these people, the choice they had made to move away from their traditional diet to one of farming was actually written in their bones, and it's there for us to see. But let's leave the past, and we're going to move forward a little farther on our timeline, and let's go to the 19th century. Let's go to London in the 1860s, and let's go to a man named William Banting. I'm sure you guys have heard of him. William Banting was a London undertaker and a cabinet maker and a casket maker to the stars, so it said in what I read. And he had gotten such a ponderous belly that he was unable to walk down the stairs forward. He had to turn around backward so that he could see where to put his feet and not become overbalanced. And he tried various remedies of the day to lose weight. He took vapor baths and and various assorted cures. He tried exercising more by walking and rowing. And at some point, he was put on diets that were very low calorie, as you can see from this one, bread-centric diets where he ate basically bread and milk and sugar and a little bit of meat. And he really, like so many very overweight people, made very little lasting progress and was, I think, depressed and disappointed about it. And finally, he gave up and wasn't trying to do anything. And he was just very overweight. And at one point, he went to see a noted ear, nose, and throat doctor of the day, not for weight loss, but for hearing loss. And the doctor examined him, and he said, well, there's nothing wrong with your ears except the rolls of fat around them that are keeping you from being able to hear. And if you want to hear, you're going to have to lose weight. And it was an interesting moment of serendipity because his doctor, whose name was William Harvey, not of circulation fame, but same name, a different man, had just been to a conference like this one, sort of, in Paris or in France. And he had heard a talk by the famous French physiologist Claude Bernard, who gave a talk about his new discovery of glycogen and the glycogenic role of the liver in diabetes. And so, as I hope somebody here does, Dr. Harvey took that message back to his own practice and decided to apply it to the obesity of Mr. Banting. And so he put him on a diet that was called a saccharin-free diet, which meant that it had no sugar or starch. And it looked something like this. As you can see, there's a lot more food in this one than what Mr. Banting was eating before, and it's very meat-centric. You have lots and lots of ounces of all kinds of meat in there, and I was kind of happy to notice it's also very claret-centric, and there's whiskey involved. So it's a diet I could wrap my arms around for sure, and I could be happy with that. So there you go, meat, claret, and whiskey. If you add all that up, it's nearly a pound of meat that he was eating every day, and and a bottle of good claret, I'm in, and a tumbler of whiskey or gin. Depends on your preference, I guess. Anyway, Mr. Banting adopted this diet, and he did so well on it. He had such resounding success that he decided that he wanted to share his results, which, again, that's the message from here, share your results. He wanted to share his results and let other people know about it. And so, at his own expense, he wrote up the details of his diet and had it printed in a pamphlet that he called The Letter on Corpulence. And he gave it away to people just as a service to his fellow man. And it became so popular that people said, well, you really ought to charge for this. And so he began charging for it, but he gave the profits away to charity, which I thought was very nice of him. It was hugely popular on both sides of the Atlantic. It was so popular in America, in fact, that the Salisbury steak was invented to help people what they called bant. His name became synonymous with dieting for weight loss. And it still is in a number of places in the world, England being one of them, and I know South Africa, and I don't know about here, but Banting is still dieting for weight loss. And the very first diet blockbuster was born by Mr. William Banting. So that's a huge waypoint in the history of the low-carb diet. Let's move a little bit forward to the 1920s and to a man you've heard about earlier, Wilhelm Stephenson, who spent a good number of years, decades really, exploring the Arctic wilderness and charting it and mapping it and living with the Inuit, where he ate basically a diet of meat and fat and fish and did very well on that. He was a kind of a bon vivant. He was a celebrity of his day, and he talked about his diet and he wrote about his diet. And everybody was not quite as convinced that he was on the right path. Just like today, there was great debate about whether it should be, the vegetarian diet of, the Kellogg Sanitarium, or whether it should be this diet, this Eskimo diet, they called it, that Stephenson touted. And so he and a fellow explorer agreed to go into a 1-year supervised all-meat diet at Bellevue Hospital, well, part of the time at Bellevue and part when they were supervised outside the hospital, to prove their point. And just as was the case with us, the warnings went up. People are going to die. Thousands of people are going to die. If you let these men stay in there and do this, they're going to die. This is not right. You shouldn't be doing this. And really, at first, Stephenson did have a few problems. And the reason he did is because his doctors apparently on purpose, gave him very, very lean meat. And in just a few days, he became sick on it and kind of had gastric distress and other gastric issues we don't need to say after lunch. And so he said, look, you've got to give me fat. I have to have more fat. And so once they did that and they got him to a diet that was about 80% fat and 20% protein, he did fine. Anderson did fine. Both men did fine. And the fact that they did fine on this diet of meat and fat and water and no vegetables was apparently deemed news that's fit to print by the New York Times. And so they write up, they do well on a diet of meat and water. They stayed with the diet for a year and did fine. And really, they weren't concerned that they wouldn't, because after all, they'd spent a fair amount more time than a year eating this diet with the Inuit and not having problems, and under conditions much harsher than the New York City of 1920. Stephenson himself said after the fact that he had been examined from head to toe, and I think in white the salient part is that they had been unable to find even a shred of evidence that there were any of the problems that people said were going to happen would happen. Stephenson continued to advocate for a meat and fat diet really for the rest of his life. He wrote many, many books about it, which, along with the letter on corpulence, an original copy, and Stephenson's books are in Mike's library and among his most prized possessions. The work of Stephenson and really the work of Banting inspired others, and you've heard a little bit about one of these, the first being Dr. Blake Donaldson, who Mike talked about, who was a big game hunter and a crusty old New York physician of about a half a century, who had come under the influence of Stephenson, had really thought, was enamored of his tales of the Arctic and of what happened with his health. And he decided to put his own patients on this meat and fat diet because he said it makes so much sense. This is what we were designed to eat. Smart man. And he put them on there for anything, skin rash, gut problems, heart disease, diabetes, overweight. Whatever it was, the meat and fat diet was his remedy. In fact, he wrote a book about it that he calls the doctor's fight against the two most terrible diseases that afflict humankind, which one was obesity with all its attendant 6 dangerous diseases, which is the metabolic syndrome. He didn't call it that, but that's basically what he's talking about. And allergy, which of course is also a disease that I think is helped by a low-carb diet. But he used that for just about everything, and he put him on a diet of fatty beef and black coffee 3 times a day, and then they drank water in between breakfast and lunch and dinner. And if they didn't want to do that, they could go find a different doctor. That was his remedy. He was totally not politically correct. And as Mike said earlier today, that every weakling that wasn't able to survive well on a fat meat and freshwater diet might as well and then just go away. He didn't want anything to do with it. He didn't have time for it. The other gentleman who was influenced by Banting, I think especially, and probably by Stephenson too, was a gentleman named Alfred Pennington. And he was hired by the DuPont laboratories to put their executives who were overweight and out of shape on a diet and try to help them get better, which he did, and he didn't write books about it, but he wrote papers about it that he published in the New England Journal and also the Journal of Nutrition. And those papers probably, during his literature search, came to the attention of a doctor that we all know very well, and that we're going to talk about in just a minute, but just keep that in the back of your mind. The diet that he put the men on is very, very similar to the same diet that William Harvey had put Mr. Banting on 100 years before. So we've drug the low-carb diet forward 100 years now, and Pennington used basically that same structure. Let's first go to another little waypoint along in history, and it's to a battle between these two individuals. On your left is John Yudkin, and on the right is Ansel Keys. Dr. Keys, as you all may know, was a physiologist who had a keen interest in nutrition. He is who developed K rations, thus the K of K rations, from Keys during World War II, and undertook the Minnesota starvation studies at the end of the war, toward the end of the war, to determine how best to feed a starving population. apparently, I would say not the way he fed these men, because they didn't do very well. But at the time, and just after the war, it wasn't underfeeding in the West, in America, that was the biggest problem. It was heart disease. Men were having heart attacks, and it became a real issue because so many people had begun to have heart attacks, but there was this one specific heart attack, which was President Eisenhower's heart attack, that kicked the whole search for what is the cause for heart disease, what's the dietary cause, that's what they were all looking for heart disease, into high gear. Keyes had decided it was animal fats. And he was working on and later published his famous 7-country study, which seemed to show that the countries that ate the most animal fat had the most heart disease. So, ipso facto, it's fat. People who are detractors of his study say that there was evidence for 22 countries that he didn't decide to use, that he chose to compile the data just on countries that fit his curve. And I don't know if that's true. Certainly the people who are pro-Keyes say it's not. The people who are his detractors say it is. But at the time, this other gentleman, Dr. Yudkin, made the point that if you took the data heart disease, the data that was out there, you could fit a better curve for sugar and heart disease than you could for fat. And in fact, he made the point that you could fit a pretty good curve for the number of televisions per household and heart disease than you could for fat. And he was making the point that whatever Dr. Keyes said, this is all observation. It's all correlation, and correlation isn't causation. He hadn't proved anything, and that was sort of Dr. Yudkin's point. But based on the force of his very strong personality and a lot of people in high places, Ansel Keys ended up on the cover of Time magazine, and the whole idea that fat is the culprit in heart disease really began to take root. But he was, even though they'd pushed this forward, everybody was not on board with this being the cause, and there were still a few people out crying in the wilderness and writing books, and these were very, very high-selling books in the 60s. The Drinking Man's Diet and the Quick Weight Loss Diet, both very big sellers. And then Dr. Yudkin published a book in '72 that was called Pure, White, and Deadly, which was an indictment against sugar as the cause for heart disease. And it was in that same year, 1972, we're going to bring that those Pennington papers forward, that this gentleman wrote a book that everybody here is familiar with, Dr. Atkins' Diet Revolution, which sold 15 million copies. I mean, it was a huge bestseller, and yet it brought him into the crosshairs of a gathering and very powerful lobby, political and more, of George McGovern and his committee on nutrition and human needs that had been stood up to determine I think probably in the face of what was causing heart disease, but to determine the right course for the nation. Totally non-scientific committee, and as you've heard earlier, with a vegetarian bent and already had making the decision that animal fat was the culprit, based on absolutely nothing, no data, but it became codified into law, and we entered what I call the Dark Ages of nutrition, embodied in this structure, which is 6 to 11 servings of bread and cereal grains that did nobody any good. All that happened in those intervening years was that health got worse, people got fatter, people got sicker, and the structure's shape, I think, is telling, because I don't think this is an accident. I could be wrong. I'm not sure. But it was at this juncture, when the world is in the grip of low fat, that, we two geniuses decided to write a book in 1996 about eating meat and fat and not a whole lot of carbs, and it was a very different message than was out there at the time. But, based on really a lot of marketing that was done for it, it did become a bestseller, which was good. Dr. Atkins' book that had been kind of languishing, his New Diet Revolution, was pulled back up, and it became a bestseller, and we were both on the bestseller list together for a good while. And out of that, I think people had the thought or the courage, the whatever, to say, yeah, I know about that too. And again, a whole ton of books have been written on different ways to do a low-carb diet. But I think what really moved the market forward, at least pushed the needle to make low carb more acceptable, was when scientific journalists got in it. People without a dog in the fight, as they would say. You have no book to sell. Gary Taub's 2002 article, What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie, I think did more to push forward the credibility of the low-carb diet than maybe anything that went before it. And since that time, of course, he's written a book, and Nina Taub's book, both have really been seminal in pushing this whole movement forward. And then the thing that needed to happen that everybody said for years, well, where are the studies? Well, the studies came. And Jeff Volek and Steve Phinney and so many others who do bench research have just flooded the airwaves with studies. The Public Health Collaboration has assembled now 67 randomized controlled trials pitting the low-carb diet against the low-fat diet, and you know who won. Again and again and again, the low-carb diet is verified as being a better way to lose weight and a better way to regain your health. And it really makes such sense that it would be, because really, no matter how technically advanced we become, our physiology, our biochemistry, our genome was honed to eat a meat and fat diet, and a return to it bringing better health shouldn't surprise us, because basically we're cavemen in designer suits with cell phones, but our Stone Age physiology knows what it's supposed to eat. The low-carb story is 3.5 million years old, but it's going to go on. We're going to keep pushing it forward with, I hope, this book in 2024, and I do. Thank you.